Hello, in this video we're going to talk about Nurbs curves. Okay, so a Nurb is a non-uniform rational B-spline, and you can use curves to make lines and then loft them together and make patches, but we're just going to use Nurbs curves as controllers. This is the industry standard. What most rigs you will look at that you download, they're controlled by curve handles. Okay, so what's curve? So let's go to create curve tools, and what I'm going to do, if you click on the top of one of these menu bars, that tears it off and leaves it right here for you to monkey around with. So I usually use EP curve tool. All right, so I'm going to show you how that works. So I'm going to click on the option box, Control-Shift-Click, and then you'll see that it appeared there on my shelf. I can also do CV curve option box, and that went on my shelf. Okay, so if I click the EP curve, then what I can do is, I'm in the top view here, I'm in 3-degree cubic, and this makes a curve sort of like what you might see in Adobe Illustrator. Now I can close this off by snapping to, using this icon here, I can snap to this point. So if I just click there, that's going to snap to the point, hit enter, and so now I've got a Nurbs curve. Okay, so this curve is in object mode now, and that's this button right here. Okay, so this will toggle between objects and components, just the same way that geometry would. We can also right-click and go to object, or we can go to component mode. So those components on curves, it's going to default to CVs, which are control vertices. If I hit W, the way these work are, you just grab these CVs and you can kind of reshape your curve after the fact. The little U here, it kind of helps maintain the tangency of these two curves that are on the same plane, or same, these curves that are connected. Right click again and I can go to object mode. So if I hit F8, which toggles between component and object mode, you notice that when you go to F8, it defaults to these CV curves. We can right click and we can also say curve point. Curve points are a little harder to, so here we just, put a point down and then we can select it, or we can just show it. I don't use that option. We can also go to edit point. So these are the edit points of that curve. And then we can also go to hull, which is, if you click on the hull, these verts on the hull, which is just essentially a line connecting all of the CVs. So switch back to CV and then you can see it's just a different way of visualizing it. Okay. So let's do this again now. Just hit F8, object mode. So now we're going to go to EP curve editor, and this time I'm going to hit linear. And with linear, I can just draw linear shapes. And again, I can hold down the V or click on this magnet and I can snap to the end of the of that edge of that point, and so now I've got, you know, square controllers. So that's when you're on linear. Linear will make square, cubic will make round. Okay, and then there's also a CV curve, which is, it's just a different way of putting your curves down. V, snap. So a CV curve, it's same, it's, for all intents and purposes, it's really a similar thing. Except on a CV curve, it's really pretty much the same thing, except with the CV, you're drawing the different points, and the curve kind of builds itself between the points. So you still edit it the same way. It still has edit points, just like this one does, and this one still has CVs, just like this one does. So I usually just stick with edit point when I make my curves, but you can use either one. Okay, so now we're in object mode. When you create things on a plane, for example, we created this on the top in the perspective view, they're going to be, the curves are going to be essentially lined up to the perspective view. And the same thing if we went over to create a cube on the side view, or a curve rather. So now we see that curve built on the side in X. Now you can hit the G key to repeat the last command. V to snap. So now we've got curves on all three planes. Then of course, so now let's talk about the transforms of a curve. Okay, so we can move it, we can rotate it. If you just click within the dial, you're rotating all three axes. You can scale it, R key. Okay, so when I talk about freezing transformations, this is what I'm referring to. You create a controller and then you put it out in space next to a joint, and if you want this to control a joint or some other thing, if these things aren't zeroed out, you're essentially going to take all these along for the ride with you, and your rig will frustrate you to no end. So again, at this point we freeze transformations, modify, freeze transformations. So I use freeze, reset, and center pivot. Okay, so notice all these values over here. Click on freeze. Now those values are 0. So this is now the happy point, or the happy place, you could say, for this the home place for this controller. Okay, now if we wanted to reset the pivot, or reset the transform, you click RT, and that's going to send the pivot point back there. But it is still zeroed out. However, if you wanted to rotate this guy around, now you're rotating around this pivot point, which is down here. So this is why center pivot might be more optimal for rotating this controller. Okay, since we're talking about rotations here, I'm going to double click on the rotation icon. And that's the same thing as popping out the tool settings right here. Okay, so right now this axis orientation is to object. We can also go to world or object. And it's really the same thing. We're not really getting much of a difference here. But if we were to rotate this, and then if we went between object and world, you'll see that the transformations, or you'll see that the orientation changes. And so that's the difference between world space and local space. I hit the W key too to have to visualize that. So world space is just like down here. X is that way, your Z is forward, and your Y is up. So that's the world space of the sky after rotating it. Now if I go back to object space, then you can see that the coordinate system has changed, and it's aligned itself to the rotation that we just put in. So a lot of times I will run my controllers, or I'll set them up so that they can work on local translation. You just have to decide on whether or not you want object or world, and you can change these at any time. So here I've rotated it. So if I just again hit freeze transforms, that's going to zero it out. Then the last thing about these, some more pivot information is, so the pivot for this cube is over here at the center. Now if I want to change my pivot, I can press the D key, and then I can snap to either curves or points or the grid. So if I wanted to snap to the grid, I can hold X, and then if I move this around, it's just snapping to the grid. It's assuming that the grid goes off into infinity, so it'll keep snapping. Okay, or I can snap to a curve, or hold down the C key. And so here, what's going to happen is if I get it close enough to the curve, then it's going to snap to the curve. And so I'm kind of rotating counterclockwise and then clockwise here with my mouse. Then you hit D again, and so that's going to be where the pivot is. Okay, and I can also snap the pivot to a vertex or a control vertex. So again, hit D, V, and then that'll snap to that vertex. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up my outliner. If I just click on this button, that'll show it there. Click on that to hide the tool settings. So here are all my curves, and just like everything else, you can group them, Control G, so that they all have, and then once you do that, their origin comes at 0. Before you were to group everything, again, you'd want to make sure that all the elements were zeroed out. Okay, so I'm going to delete that. Now another way of making curves is just using the crate, Nurbs primitives, and I use circle a lot. I don't use square because it winds up making 4 different curves, and so it gives me a more complex shape that I don't want. So I'll normally use circle. So let's create circle, Control Shift click, and let's put that up here. So if I click on circle, let's reset the settings and say apply, which will apply the settings to the dialog and also create it. So that is a default Nurbs curve. Okay. I can also go back in and make another one. This time, give it a normal axis of X. So create. And do it another time, give it a normal axis of Z. Create. So that's how I can get curves on different axes. I'm going to move these over. Then if I just create a curve again, since I've reset these settings, if I wanted to reset it, I could just do that and then hit apply. And if I come out again, the defaults are applied. And again, they have the CVs, so you can take a curve and you can have a lot of fun with them. I wanted to make different shapes. Object mode. So, those are controllers.